It's one thing for me as a climate scientist to say, hey, we should be worried about extreme heat days in 2080 when there are communities that don't have hardly any municipal staff right now who have sewage in their basements because their pump station failed. What are the response structures we have in place so that we can show up for those day-to-day issues? And when they do occur, that we actually have the tools to respond to the here and now.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode explores how communities can survive in a changed environment, from rising seas to shifting weather patterns. Our guests today are two nationally recognized experts in climate resilience and adaptation. With decades of public service, Jim Murley is the former Chief Resilience Officer for Miami-Dade County, where he led efforts to prepare one of America's most climate-vulnerable regions for sea level rise, hurricanes, and other environmental stressors. Dr. Heidi Roop is director of the University of Minnesota's Climate Adaptation Partnership and the author of the Climate Action Handbook, a visual guide to 100 climate solutions for everyone. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by setting the stage for our listeners. When the Academy started our Extreme Weather Resilience Hub just recently, I learned that the terms adaptation, resilience, and mitigation all have different meanings when it comes to climate change. And those meanings and those distinctions are really important. Can you talk to us about those differences? Maybe Heidi, we can start with you.
So I'm an academic, so I will try to refrain from defaulting into all the nuances and how we've spliced and diced adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. I think as we look to what we're grappling with as a global society, really encouraging folks not to make false distinctions or sort of separate the whole ecosystem of action that's really required. And also acknowledge that a lot of the communities, for example, that we work with at the Climate Adaptation Partnership, I think nationally and globally, resilience means something different. And asking for and seeking resilience is also a very nuanced conversation and one that needs to be sort of handled with care. So just sort of those caveats up front. When I think about adaptation and mitigation, I like to think about adaptation representing those things we need to do to prepare for the impacts of a warmer world that we know we've already set in motion, right? We know we've committed to change. Jim can speak more to this in the context of sea level rise, for example, where we're looking at having locked in commitments for the next 1,000 years or more, right? So when you've changed your exposure to a risk by a certain amount, you know you have to prepare. So adaptation are those actions or interventions and investments we make to prepare our communities, our businesses, our supply chains, you name it, the thing you care about, for the impacts of a warming world. Mitigation, on the other hand, related, but in sort of conversation with adaptation, are the actions that we take and the investments we make to reduce the production, and now, beginning more and more, remove carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, the things that are driving the changes that we're experiencing, the thing that's causing the warming, right? Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so what we want to do is mitigate those from going into the atmosphere in the first place. And now we're in a position, if we want to reach our global policy targets, of actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we're preparing while we're also then preventing warming from occurring. And then what I like to think about resilience, that's the gap in between those two things. So how well we do those two things results in sort of a gap. How prepared are we and how much warming and impact have we avoided? That I refer to sort of as our resilience gap, right? What we aren't prepared for. Are we able to weather the storm? Can we bounce back quickly and can we bounce forward toward a more prepared, equitable, and resilient world? So that's sort of how I think about those three things in relationship to one another. But I'm sure Jim has much more to offer, but that's my take.
I'm an attorney in practice, so of course I have to go nitpick each word. But no, I think Heidi did a great job. I think mitigation starts with, in terms of environmental policy, it has all sorts of meaning. But as we started to look at adaptation in a context at local government, at least, it was from a framework where a lot of us had been doing pre-storm mitigation or post-storm mitigation, sort of the FEMA language. You know, it's tied to the grant programs that you're there or not there that happen to a community if they're hit by, in our case, usually a hurricane, but around the country, the flash floods or many other types of disasters. So we had to kind of peel the adaptation part out. And for us, it became broadening the concept of pre-storm mitigation. It became every investment local government made, we needed to focus on what was the element that we needed to add to make us adapt more easily to the storm event or come back and recover better after the storm event. So adaptation became built on that kind of structure that a lot of us were involved in because of FEMA. Now, resilience is interesting. I mean, it was a word in the dictionary, right? Resiliency. I'm not sure resiliency was ever a word, by the way, but it has become a substitute. Certainly for us and for a lot of communities directly involved, or if they followed 100 Resilient Cities by Rockefeller, they brought an immense amount of data and study and theory of change to this whole area. And when they were going strong, they were supplying a lot of great information, and communities were, as Miami-Dade did, developing a resilience plan. But when I look back on that effort, the thing that I found most productive about the framework that the resilience planning brought at that time was the distinction between stresses and shocks. So I think that there's other things that came from the work that the Rockefeller Foundation did, and excellent post-study of that program done by the Urban Institute, which goes into detail about what worked and what didn't work.
Now that we have a little better understanding of resilience and mitigation and adaptation, let's dive a little bit more into something I heard you say, Jim, around study and the theory of change. Now, Jim, you've worked on resilience planning in one of the most exposed regions in the country. What lessons has Miami-Dade learned about adapting to sea level rise and extreme weather or other events? And what can other regions take from that experience?
Well, there's a lot. And of course, I'm now retired. So I'm looking back on, 10 years of running that program and complaining about what they're doing now. Right? No, when we sat down to do some of the forward looking plans, and I think Heidi mentioned this, we're looking at eons, we're the international projections, the national climate projections, they're out decades. They're based on a lot of assumptions. And we did those. And I think it was some of our best work. But they were difficult to connect to people's day-to-day issues. And if you cannot connect those long-range issues back to something that the average citizen is experiencing, which they will then communicate to the average local elected official, because you're going to need funds in tight budget years, and you've got to be able to connect these long-range projections. And of course, we're going through a time right now where all of this seems to be in question. And it's very difficult. We should be able to argue the strengths and weaknesses of different positions and different theories of change, if you will. But we got to find middle ground and move forward, because we have to be able to continue to support of our local citizens for these efforts.
Well, Heidi, let's talk about moving forward and connecting to the day-to-day issues. Your work spans science, policy, and public engagement. How do you ensure science around environmental changes is not just accurate, but actually actionable? Like, what strategies help bridge that gap between research and real world decision making?
This is really at the heart of how we try to do our work at the Climate Adaptation Partnership. And it really is that partnership. So we don't do quote unquote science. I think there's lots of ways of generating knowledge and informing one another's sort of knowledge and knowledge systems. And so the science we pursue, the grants we write to do that research is all done in relationship with people with whom we intend for them to use the information, or maybe are coming to us seeking information. And maybe us saying, well, we don't actually have sufficient evidence to support or answer that question for you in a manner that would allow you to make an informed decision, or use evidence in how you direct, say, those funds or that management action, whether you're talking about an agricultural field or a forest that might be being managed for timber or might be being managed for recreation and to the benefit of sort of the broader planet, right? We are often doing the work we do, whether that's generating, say, climate projections. So we do a lot of, sort of Jim alluded to this, right? Thinking about, well, if we want to understand our risks and our exposure to those risks, we now need to start thinking about how we characterize what those might look like. What is the magnitude of change we expect in things like extreme heat, or what might drive more infectious disease into a region, whether that's a pest for a plant or a pest for a human. What is that going to do to the systems that we rely on, right? Our healthcare systems, our timber industry, our agricultural sector. And we generate insights that help us understand what the sort of general direction of change might be, or how we might expect those things to change in the future. But say what variables we develop and do the science on, we're getting feedback with and understanding directly from, say, the agricultural sector. What is it that you really want to understand, right? We might not necessarily make projections of soil temperature, but it turns out that's really important if you're trying to grow food. And that helps them push the advances in the science that we do. So that science to action spectrum, really the heart in between there is sort of constant communication and that building of trust and iterating, right? So science is ultimately a series of questions, and we're answering questions and maybe getting incremental insights or knowledge, but we continue to return back to answering and addressing the questions that we hear people asking and that they want information around. And so that's really how we guide all of our work and the research that we do. And we've been fortunate to be able to have support from the state of Minnesota, from the legislature, to advance some of this work, and have brought together coalitions of different partners who are seeking that information for different reasons and supporting our work and working in partnership with us to advance that science. So feel very fortunate to be doing the work that I do. And I'm part of a land grant extension university, right? Part of our mission as an institution is to work with, in, and provide public value to every Minnesotan. And we take that really seriously at our group. And we have folks who live and work across the state of Minnesota, and so are in dialogue, and that dialogue drives the work that we do.
Let's broaden the discussion a little bit more. We can all agree we're in a critical moment when it comes to the United States' leadership on the global stage. The New York Times recently published an article about the radical transformation of America's environmental role. Tell our listeners your perspective. What's our country's leadership role, responsibility, and impact when it comes to climate science and adaptation? Jim, you can share some of your comments, and then obviously, Heidi, your perspective would be helpful here as well.
This is a major challenge. And I think, like Heidi, as she referenced her partnerships, and we built all of our work on regional partnerships, work with federal agencies and at the interstate regional level. Miami is lucky that we have consul general offices from over 70 countries around the world, and we're constantly having those discussions. I mean, I think countries they go through phases. I think our neighboring countries are acknowledging that and making their adjustments. I want to reference Heidi's really good description of science. That should be a common denominator across all the other value-based discussions that we're having. But then we have to get, our hands dirty around the values, because if we don't, we will lose this. And I think it is about demonstrating at the local level what we value and where we need partnerships with our fellow governmental levels. The other two, for us at least, and I think this is common, is our universities play such a key role, giving us the science, but also feedback from the alumni, from the students, the teachers. They're people in our communities, and the business community. The business community wants to know if public dollars are going to be spent, what's the return on investment? And probably one of the most impactful documents that we produce, actually we did this regionally, multi-county, with our business community and with the Urban Land Institute, is a study on return on investment in adaptation. Real numbers presented in the way that a business person can understand them. So we just need to keep on those two links, and we need to deal with the value discussion that's going on.
Heidi, Jim just talked about partnership and community. Across sectors, disciplines, levels of government, what does effective climate collaboration look like? And what might be the barriers that would be in the way?
I think you're really building on what Jim just said. I think really speaking to both the criticality of subnational leadership, particularly in the moment that we find ourselves in, right? But while not losing sight of the critical role that the United States has played on the global stage in regards to thinking broadly about climate response, right? Climate risk management on a global scale when we're talking about mitigation or adaptation. We can probably have an entire podcast about, what we stand to lose as we, at the federal level in particular, retreat from that leadership that we've had for decades now. There are real consequences to that, but I think effective communication and doing this work effectively, I think you're speaking to two folks who have worked in that interagency federal space and have really been at the ground level implementing at that subnational local level. I could not agree more with identifying and communicating and articulating around those shared values. I think right now in particular, that sort of effective communication, ultimately, one of the muscles we don't exercise enough is listening. I think finding those shared values is really understanding, coming right back to what was said, what Jim said earlier, right? Connecting to those day-to-day issues. It's one thing for me as a climate scientist to say, hey, we should be worried about extreme heat days in 2080 when there are communities that don't have hardly any municipal staff right now who have sewage in their basements because their pump station failed. Right. We need as an organization, and I think as entities working together and collaborating as we think about across scales of government, what are the response structures we have in place so that we can show up for those day-to-day issues. And when they do occur, say, these events, these shocks, right, that we actually have the tools to respond to the here and now and integrate in a values and place-specific way the how do we prevent this from happening again? The thing like, oh, well, maybe we should consider the 2050s when we resize this culvert or think about how to build energy resilience into the stormwater system because its failure results in 400 homes having sewage in them, right? For which right now we're scrambling. We don't have the systems in place. And so I think that effective communication is both the listening, but being prepared to think about how you show up with what matters when it matters, right? And that's kind of foreign for, say, a university, for example. When there's a problem, we may not be the ones to implement a solution, but we're networked with one another so that we can connect communities and businesses to people who might connect them to the resources and around knowledge to help respond, right? We don't deal with sewage in basements, but we can help pick up the phone to call our pollution control agency or Department of Health and connect people to those day-to-day issues that then open doors for these deeper conversations around how do you do that planning now to prevent this from happening again in this community. These impacts are coming to a place you care about if they haven't already. And so I think it's those social networks and that effective communication and trust are going to be really at the heart of how we move through, frankly, a period of distrust in science and of one another. Relationships are going to be really key. So that's sort of, again, the perspective we bring to the work. And how you scale that is by more of us linking arms and being willing to work together and maybe use different words, right? Not everybody calls things adaptation. I wish we did, but even Jim and I don't necessarily share the same lexicon, and that's fine if we're moving in a direction together.
Clearly, this is an important issue, and it has to do with more than just the terminology we use. Jim, maybe give us a sense of what happens, what's the risk if we don't get this right, if we don't think strategically about how to prepare and how to respond, how to build hardened communities and infrastructure. How bad can it get?
Sounds like a Hollywood movie. There's, in real time, if we were put on the Weather Channel, you'd see, I don't know what category that hurricane is, but it went from category 1 to category 5 in less than 24 hours. Now it's still out in the ocean. That's unheard of. We got hit by a category 5 hurricane in 1992, Hurricane Andrew. And the devastation is like what we saw out in Texas, the walls of water. That's the risk of not thinking through these steps that we should take, because there are, unfortunately, some of the events, this extreme weather that we're worried about is escalating. And it's not a theory or science. We're seeing it out real time. Thank goodness we had more warning with a hurricane than those poor folks did in Texas. That's the risk is about, maintaining the kind of continuity in a community that we've all been talking about. And it starts with good public administration. If you don't trust your elected officials and the people who are working for them, who have to make these instantaneous decisions in the course of these events, pre and post, then the system doesn't work. I think Heidi used the word trust. That's absolutely essential. So everything else we're doing, we have to build that trust in our actions and the way we listen and the way we communicate.
Heidi, use the word trust. I also heard you say home and talk about people. Your recent book focuses on individual and community level actions. What role do everyday people play in building resilience?
I think resilience starts with us. I think that everyone has a role in building resilience. And I think even if say climate change isn't the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning like it does for me, I know I'm perhaps a rare breed. Protecting your family and your loved ones and the community around you, I think we can usually weave some shared values out of that. And so I do think that people thinking about their own individual resilience or preparedness is a great place to start, and a step that can often lead to more coordination. And just as a bit of an anecdote, one of the actions of the 100 for the book is having an emergency preparedness kit and a go bag. More familiar to folks like Jim who've lived in hurricane-prone geographies, maybe a little less familiar for a Minnesota geography, although we can weather winter storms quite well. But so few people are prepared. But however, when I've queried rooms, this is an informal polling endeavor, and asked if people have had a preparedness kit. Do you have any plan? Do you know like an evacuation route, or do you have water in your basement for if you need to stay? What would you do if your power went out for a week or two? Very few people, far less than 5%, would raise their hand. But when I said, well, what about connecting with your neighbors and saying, you know what, we'll think about storing water or buying a communal sort of air water quality purification system. And this household might already have invested in a backup battery. That sort of community, right, where individuals all of a sudden connected and we're weaving this tapestry of being more prepared with and around one another. In the culture and environment that I live in, there's a lot of care for neighbor. Right. And so connecting action through working in collaboration with your neighbors or with faith communities is a big way that we start and engage in these conversations. In fact, when we're recording this, it is the first day of the Minnesota State Fair, and our team was on the ground. And the thing we did this year for climate action was all around individual and community preparedness. And so we were handing out actually fridge magnets around how to make sure you're hydrated, your emergency phone call numbers, who will you call, right? If your phone is dead or you are only going to be able to text, right? Do you have that quick, handy information? How do you interpret the air quality index and know how to protect yourself and your loved ones, right? Do you go to soccer practice today with your kids? Yes or no? We were thinking about how to actually engage in conversation around climate with the entry point of being prepared, protecting yourself, protecting your loved ones, and protecting the places you love.
It seems simple, but it's really important. Be prepared, have a plan, know what action steps you're going to take. Jim, looking ahead, if you could implement one policy to accelerate climate adaptation and resilience in the U.S., what would it be and why?
This one's one of these really tough issues, but it is impacting everybody that lives in an area that may be affected by these events, and it's insurance. We have built a whole investment structure around ensuring our most valuable investments, our homes, and many other things. And the signals that insurance sends or doesn't send in this economy and how it's coordinated, so much more needs to be done. And states have crafted solutions that are good for them. We're not exactly sure where we're headed with FEMA and all important flood insurance. But I just think that that's a key point. It won't be a federal mandate, but it needs to be a collaborative effort informed by good studies and work with national academies and others. These things just multiply in terms of their impacts if you have to actually experience the storm. So insurance is one I worry about.
And Heidi, you gave really good advice to the individual person and the community. Perhaps you could also give some advice to state and federal leaders. What's one piece of advice you would give to those leaders trying to address these critical issues we're talking about?
In this moment, my response would be, to the extent possible, authentic coordination, interagency coordination. I fully appreciate silos and bureaucracies and individual agencies needing to get credit for and manage their own parts of these complex puzzles. But there's nothing that breeds greater distrust than one entity saying one thing and the other saying the other, or even sharing information that might be purporting to be representing the same change, but look and feel and perhaps be interpreted completely differently. To the extent that we can be really linking arms and be well coordinated, particularly in the moments of need that our communities have, I think it serves us all the better. And it puts us on a forward foot for when we are in recovery and thinking about how we rebuild, that we can take advantage of those crises to build back better, build back stronger. And so that only happens if different agencies who manage different parts of our communities and economy are working with one another and know what one another are doing. I know that's a tall order.
The National Academy of Public Administration recently launched its Extreme Weather Resilience Hub for the exact reasons we've been talking about today. This is an important issue that we have to get right, and it involves people and communities. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us, Dr. Heidi Roop and Jim Murley. Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie, Alwan, and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.